The silence in the room was unnerving. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because nothing had gone wrong. Not yet. The fluorescent hum of Moscow's KGB headquarters flickered over marble floors and polished boots, at a secure operations center deep beneath the Lubyanka. A low-ranking signals officer leaned into his headset and frowned. The channel to Warsaw, one of their most hardened embassy lines, was spiking with interference. At first, he assumed solar activity. Then he rerouted through a backup trunk. Same result: distortion. Static. Then a sharp cut to silence. He logged the anomaly. Protocol. It would be reviewed by morning. But by the time morning came, Warsaw Station was dark, and 5 Soviet agents in Europe had been rolled up overnight. No alarms had sounded, no security breach had been flagged, yet somehow, within hours, NATO operatives had dismantled one of the KGB's most critical listening posts. Polish safe houses were burned. Couriers vanished. A French intelligence officer casually handed over a sealed packet, confessing he had received it weeks ago from an unknown Russian contact. The papers inside were authentic KGB network maps. The Kremlin was stunned. Inside the upper ranks of the KGB's first chief directorate, speculation ran wild: a Western satellite breach, a Stasi mole deliberate sabotage from Washington. But then a new cable arrived, hand-delivered, typed on an old Soviet Olympia machine. It contained the next wave of internal passwords to the KGB's encrypted foreign asset logs. It hadn't been intercepted, it had been leaked. Worse, it matched the actual codes down to the character, far across the Atlantic, at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. A senior counterintelligence officer stood before a locked drawer. Inside was a cassette. No label, no markings, only a single red triangle drawn with a felt pen. He placed it into the machine, pressed play, and listened. The voice on the tape was calm, precise, Russian-accented English. Packet 1 was delivered. Moscow suspects Warsaw. They're wrong. That voice had become Langley's most valuable asset. They called him Orion. He wasn't a walk-in. He wasn't an intercepted radio tech. He was something far more dangerous, a trusted insider. Inside the Kremlin, the paranoia began to rise. They doubled internal audits, swapped codes, launched full reviews, but the damage was already done, because the man they feared most wasn't a CIA agent. He was one of their own, in the highest echelons of Soviet counterintelligence. Confidence wasn't just cultural, it was strategic. The KGB didn't just believe in its own superiority over Western services like the CIA or MI6, it relied on it. Inside a sealed conference chamber on the 12th floor of the Lubyanka, walls lined with soundproofing, a half-dozen senior officers convened. The topic, the breach in Warsaw, but no one spoke of it as treason. Not yet. The first theory floated was classic Western subversion. Perhaps an embassy janitor was compromised. Maybe a Polish handler had been flipped under duress. Typical, predictable threats, all manageable, all external. They didn't consider the possibility that the problem was internal, because that would mean their system was flawed. General Viktor Malenkov, Deputy Chief of Foreign Operations, smirked as he clicked through a slide projector. "The Americans are lazy," he said, voice tinged with practiced authority. "They hide behind satellites. They think microchips can replace discipline." The room nodded. It was the same line delivered for years. The KGB didn't need the glitz of Silicon Valley. They had tradition. They had infiltration. They had control. Control, after all, was the bedrock of Soviet intelligence. Every officer was surveilled. Every apartment bugged. Promotions required ideological screening. Mistresses were monitored. Even handwriting samples were cross-checked across operational reports for consistency. The logic was elegant if everyone is watched. No one can betray. But the logic was wrong. The deeper truth, one no one dared to speak aloud, was that the KGB's internal structure had a fatal flaw. It rewarded obedience more than insight. It preferred loyalty over innovation. And most dangerously, it assumed traitors would look like traitors. No one in that room considered that the breach had been orchestrated by someone with rank, someone who had passed every loyalty test, someone whose record was spotless, not in spite of his betrayal, but because of it. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, CIA officers were meeting in a suburban D.C. safe house. They weren't sure who their informant was yet, but the data was undeniable. Names, times, locations, rosters, all real. One analyst said aloud what everyone was thinking. This guy isn't just in their system. He is their system. But back in Moscow, the conversation remained trapped by assumption. They believed the enemy was outside. They believed the Americans couldn't outmaneuver their tradecraft. They believed loyalty, once tested, was eternal. And in that belief, they left the door wide open. Because when your system is built on the premise that you can't be infiltrated, you never see the betrayal coming. To understand how one insider nearly broke the KGB, you have to understand the system. He was born into a doctrine that trusted procedure more than people, and ideology more than instinct. Soviet intelligence was not a loose federation of analysts and field agents like its American counterpart. It was an empire of files, ranks, and rigid expectations. Every KGB officer was vetted through layers of ideological training, party loyalty reviews, family background checks, and internal surveillance. From day one, agents were taught a single truth: the greatest threat comes from the outside. Inside the walls of the Lubyanka, there was no tolerance for deviation. Promotions were tied not to performance, but to conformity. Questioning doctrine was a red flag, risk-taking a liability. The very traits that might have uncovered a mole skepticism, imagination, dissent were quietly filtered out. This wasn't oversight, it was design. The KGB's founding principle was control not just of information, but of people. If an officer could be controlled through surveillance, ideology, and hierarchy, then he could be trusted. If he couldn't, he would never rise high enough to pose a threat. That system created a paradox. The most dangerous man in the building wasn't the rule breaker. It was the rule follower who learned how to blend in. And the man now feeding the CIA KGB war plans, names of active agents, and classified encryption protocols, he'd done everything right. He was loyal, disciplined, invisible, in Langley. A CIA case officer flipped through the courier drops from Orion, noting how precise and methodical they were. No ego, no missteps. Whoever this insider was, he had been trained by the best, and he had learned their greatest weakness. They believed doctrine could replace doubt. Across Soviet directorates, that doctrine was already showing cracks. Foreign operatives began reporting strange behavior agents compromised before even meeting handlers. Drop sites burned ahead of schedule. Embassy back channels suddenly silent. Something was unraveling. And still, the Soviets clung to their model, because the alternative that their trust structure was flawed was unthinkable. To admit internal betrayal would be to admit failure of the party itself. But reality didn't care about ideology. And the moment one man weaponized their trust, the entire doctrine began to fracture. It began with a memo, typed, sealed, and left in a diplomatic pouch for routine delivery to CIA Station Vienna. The envelope looked ordinary, just another trickle in the stream of gray world chatter. But inside was something no one expected: a detailed timeline of a Soviet satellite launch, including the orbital insertion path, telemetry specs, and the precise loadout of its classified payload. It was impossible. Only 3 people in the Soviet command structure had access to that full configuration. All were cleared beyond top secret. all operated out of a restricted military division near Baikonur Cosmodrome. When Langley analysts finished verifying the information, the room went still. "How did we get this?" someone asked. The courier didn't know. The envelope had been left inside a hollowed-out volume of Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, dropped anonymously into a dead drop used once 3 years earlier. There were no fingerprints, no microdot signature, just the data, and every single number was accurate. The memo didn't just reveal the satellite's purpose, it exposed the Soviet plan to begin military encrypted data relay using a new geosynchronous node, a program so secret that it hadn't even been briefed to the Warsaw Pact allies. Back in Moscow, the KGB's signals branch received a sanitized version of the satellite specs. A quiet footnote in an internal briefing mentioned a possible Western overestimation of the system's capability. They believed it was a lucky guess, but in Vienna, the CIA knew better. They weren't guessing. Days later, a second envelope arrived. This time, it contained the identities of 2 Soviet military attachés in Rome, both active agents. Their code names, call frequencies, surveillance routes, all spelled out in fluent English, with formatting only used by KGB internal files. Now the questions turned darker. How could someone inside the Kremlin produce these files? How were they exfiltrated without detection? And what level of access would allow one man to override every fail-safe at a secret meeting in Langley? One analyst said it aloud. "We're not seeing a leak. We're seeing an open faucet." The Soviets, meanwhile, insisted the Americans were bluffing. They launched background checks on low-level staff, reviewed cleaning crews, audited embassy mail, but they never touched the real suspect list because the real suspect didn't exist. On paper, the man was flawless. On paper, he was loyal, and paper was all they trusted. The truth, when it finally reached the Kremlin, was too ugly to be real. The KGB's Warsaw network had been shattered. The Rome station was compromised. Intercepted NATO cables now aligned perfectly with Soviet deployments down to the hour. Something deep inside the Soviet machine was bleeding information, and that information was surgical. But Moscow refused to believe it. A senior committee convened in the KGB's Investigations Directorate, chaired by General Semyon Gusev. Their task determined how the Americans could have accessed internal protocols known only to a handful of ranking officers. The conclusion, Western fabrication. The Americans, they argued, were bluffing, psychological warfare. Maybe the documents were fakes built from years of careful surveillance, cobbled together to shake Soviet morale. Others suggested a captured Soviet courier had broken under pressure, handing over real data that was now being recycled to appear deeper than it was. The very idea that someone inside Moscow's command structure could voluntarily hand over secrets unthinkable. It's not betrayal. One colonel snapped during the session. It's misdirection. They doubled down on audits reviewing typewriter ribbons, cipher logs, embassy visitor records. They deployed counterintelligence teams across Prague, Berlin, and Budapest. But each investigation focused on external vectors, because the doctrine didn't allow for betrayal from the top. In that same period, 3 high-level Soviet defectors, former diplomats, and GRU analysts tried to warn their debriefers in the West, the KGB will never believe an insider could do this. You could walk a traitor into their office and they'd still suspect a janitor. They were right. The KGB's problem wasn't lack of data, it was a failure of imagination. They had so completely insulated their own hierarchy with fear and ideology that they couldn't conceive of treason by someone who believed in nothing. No defection, no ideology switch, just silence, efficiency, betrayal without a cause. Meanwhile, Orion, still unnamed, still undetected, continued to pass along detailed payload manifests, encryption formats, and personnel assignments from Moscow to Langley, week after week. He was never sloppy. He used no electronics. His drops were old-school envelopes in park benches, microfilm in hollowed screws, cassette tapes recorded in whispers. He knew the one thing the KGB couldn't see through their own belief in their invincibility. And as long as Moscow believed in that lie, the mole remained safe. By mid-1984, panic in Moscow had quietly curdled into certainty. The KGB no longer debated if a breach had occurred. They now believed they knew how it had happened. A new theory had emerged. Circulated by a clique of hardliners in the Second Chief Directorate, the Americans had deployed a new type of electronic surveillance, capable of remotely penetrating Soviet typewriters and data lines. It sounded insane, but within the paranoia of Cold War Moscow, it was embraced as the rational choice. They called it the ghost circuit hypothesis. According to the theory, the Americans had embedded micro-resonance bugs into Soviet diplomatic pouches, or even the very walls of embassies abroad. These ghost circuits, as they were nicknamed, supposedly captured electromagnetic pulses from typewriters and telex machines, reconstructing typed documents remotely. The KGB's Internal Science Division quickly generated a report over 300 pages long, citing unverified American patents and speculative articles from obscure Western electronics journals. Suddenly, the mole theory was shelved, and the new target was hardware. Agents began ripping apart teleprinters, office chairs, even lamps in secure rooms. Engineers deployed non-linear junction detectors across embassies in Europe and Asia, sweeping for phantom bugs. Soviet R&D even launched an initiative to design noise-dampening typewriter covers and Faraday-shielded walls. But none of it worked because the leak wasn't in the machines. It was in the minds behind them, across the ocean. The CIA watched with amusement as Moscow chased phantoms. Orion's drops continued, each more precise than the last. One delivery included an entire page of updated KGB internal code names and signal phrases freshly rotated, yet already compromised. Langley's counterintelligence head whispered to a subordinate, "They're trying to debug a building. We're inside the architecture." What Moscow didn't realize was that its own security doctrine made a mole more effective, not less. Because they refused to believe in betrayal, they refused to look for it. And because they saw betrayal only as emotional, a defect of loyalty or ideology, they couldn't see the truth. This traitor wasn't disloyal. He was disillusioned. The real threat wasn't in the gadgets or the wiring. It was in the silence of a man who no longer believed in the empire he served. And while they chased ghosts, he kept turning over the system, piece by piece. When months of equipment sweeps failed to yield results, Soviet leadership pivoted this time to human intelligence. But again, they aimed in the wrong direction. Now, the theory was defection by proxy. According to this new logic, there was no mole inside the KGB at all. Instead, someone outside, perhaps an Eastern Bloc ally, was acting as a silent go-between. The Americans had supposedly cultivated an asset in the Hungarian or East German intelligence services, using them to funnel Soviet secrets westward. The theory gained momentum after an intercepted NATO message referenced operations in East Berlin, one of the few areas still under joint Soviet and GDR control. Senior officers claimed this was proof that the leaks were coming from the periphery, not the center. At a Politburo intelligence summit, one general warned, "We are trusting too much in allies who still have families west of the wall." So, the crackdown began. Internal affairs officers swept through Warsaw Pact outposts. Dozens of Eastern European intelligence officers were recalled, demoted, or quietly retired. Some disappeared. Cables between Moscow and Prague were encrypted with new cipher layers. Bulgarian attachés were stripped of access to joint surveillance databases. It was a purge without evidence and without results. Meanwhile, Orion's messages continued to arrive. One included floor plans of the KGB's own new encryption facility near Kaluga, Another detailed a GRU operation to sabotage a U.S. satellite uplink in Turkey 2 weeks before the operation even began. Back in Langley, the CIA now understood just how deep Orion was embedded. He wasn't reacting. He was anticipating. And Moscow. They were looking everywhere but inward. The idea that someone in the KGB's highest ranks could betray the system remained taboo. Even as more data leaked, even as NATO began systematically dismantling Soviet assets across Europe, the Kremlin still believed the rot was outside their walls. But a rot outside the walls doesn't know the name of your encryption chief. It doesn't hand over your satellite frequencies. And it doesn't know which safe house will be used next month in Geneva. Only someone inside does. The wrong theory lived on because it was safer than the truth. Because if the mole wasn't in Berlin, or Prague, or Budapest, if he wasn't Bulgarian or Polish or East German, then he was something far worse. He was Russian. In a sealed vault beneath KGB headquarters, where surveillance was ironclad, and even cleaning crews were vetted 3 generations back. The most damaging counterintelligence failure of the Cold War unfolded undetected, unchallenged, and almost entirely unacknowledged. For 2 full years, a single man inside the Soviet system had operated in plain sight, leaking thousands of pages of top-level intelligence to the CIA, his access near total, his methods flawless, his motive still debated. But the result was irrefutable. He crippled the KGB without firing a shot. Western analysts would later call it the Quiet War, an intelligence collapse so profound it rewrote NATO strategy in real time. Dozens of Soviet operations were quietly aborted. Key agents in Paris, Bonn, and Ankara vanished overnight. Dead drops were burned, back channels exposed, and encrypted frequencies jammed before Soviet handlers even realized they'd been compromised. And Moscow, they never saw it coming. By the time they suspected an internal breach, it was already too late. Langley had mapped entire Soviet surveillance networks, predicted GRU deployments, and decrypted logistics plans meant for Warsaw Pact coordination. Thanks to Orion, NATO knew when the KGB would move, who they would use, and where they would strike before the operations even began. Worse still, Orion wasn't alone. Inspired by his success, or perhaps his silence, whispers of other quiet defectors began to surface, men and women who didn't want asylum, didn't want money, didn't even want to be known. They just wanted out from the machinery, from the lies, from the idea that belief in the system was more important than the truth. Moscow's response? More surveillance, more purges, more paranoia, but nothing touched Orion because every step the KGB took to tighten security played directly into his hands. They reassigned loyal officers, they shut down field assets, they disrupted entire chains of command, all while he kept sending information from within the building. Eventually, a list emerged in Langley, top-level Soviet officers, analysts, cipher clerks, surveillance managers. One by one, each was crossed out, cleared of suspicion, until only a few names remained, and there among them was Orion. But the CIA never moved. Why would they? The damage he was inflicting was surgical. They didn't want to save him. They wanted him to keep bleeding the system dry. Each new drop wasn't just a file, it was a test of Soviet awareness. And each time, the KGB failed. They failed not because they lacked power, or money, or reach. They failed because their ideology didn't allow for the truth that the greatest threat to the system could come from someone who built it. Langley didn't operate like the Lubyanka. And that was exactly the point. Where Soviet intelligence relied on doctrine and hierarchy layer after layer of surveillance, ideological purity tests, and internal compliance, the CIA thrived in uncertainty. It didn't demand loyalty. It incentivized results. It didn't suppress dissent. It profiled it, exploited it, weaponized it, and it worked. The CIA's counterintelligence division, then led by seasoned spymaster James Jesus Angleton, had been trained to assume one core truth. Everyone lies. Friend, foe, asset, handler. It didn't matter. The American system didn't need to believe in people. It needed to understand them. When Orion began sending his first documents, the CIA didn't scramble to unmask him. They didn't interrogate his motives or question how such a high-ranking Soviet insider could exist. Instead, they profiled his behavior, his diction, the cadence of his writing, even the way he phrased abbreviations. He was clean, methodical, controlled. No signs of ego, no calls for defection, no requests for payment. A ghost, the CIA's favorite kind. In a briefing to the U.S. National Security Council, one analyst put it simply, "We don't know who he is, but we trust his results." This approach, results over ritual, defined the American intelligence advantage. Unlike the Soviets, who sought to eliminate ambiguity, the CIA sought to live inside it. Case officers were trained not to report truth, but to triangulate behavior. Analysts didn't just read documents, they dissected them, filtered them through cultural context, internal politics, and psychological profiling. It was this flexibility that allowed the U.S. to interpret Orion's intelligence in ways the Soviets never imagined. For instance, when Orion sent over satellite orbit details, CIA analysts didn't just examine the data, they used it to reconstruct launch window protocols, estimate rocket fuel efficiency, and model Soviet fallback contingencies in the event of interception. One line of code became 1,000 lines of insight, and the more the Soviets denied there was a breach, the deeper the CIA probed. Each time Orion passed another envelope, it was fed not just to military planners but to behavioral analysts, cyberneticists, and even linguists. Langley's mission wasn't just to win battles, it was to know the enemy better than the enemy knew itself. Orion, in turn, became a kind of mirror. His intelligence didn't just reflect Soviet strategy, it exposed Soviet blindness. It revealed how deeply Moscow depended on loyalty over logic, fear over flexibility. And in that mirror, the CIA saw the core advantage of the American system. It didn't need to control people, it only needed to listen when they whispered. In the early spring of 1985, NATO launched a routine training exercise in West Germany, codenamed Operation Lion Lance. On paper, it was nothing unusual, just another armored maneuver near the Fulda Gap. But within 72 hours, the operation shifted into something else entirely. Because thanks to Orion, the CIA knew exactly what Soviet forces would do in response. The KGB had pre-positioned a network of radar units, SIGINT outposts, and armored columns along a narrow corridor designed to contain Western armor thrusts. Orion had sent detailed maps, deployment orders, even food ration allocations for those units. The Americans knew when they'd move, how they'd communicate, where they'd break, and they shattered them without firing a shot. During the exercise, NATO aircraft made maneuvers that precisely avoided Soviet detection zones, veering around blind spots that Langley knew had been incorrectly calibrated. American AWACS fed targeting data into simulated strike runs that penetrated Soviet defenses with absurd precision. From Moscow's perspective, it looked like magic, or treachery. Within 48 hours, Soviet planners requested a complete review of their detection grid. Why had their radar failed to see inbound enemy aircraft? How had simulated strikes scored 100% target acquisition rates? Were NATO systems suddenly decades ahead? It wasn't the technology. It was the insight. At one air defense center near Krakow, officers panicked when an entire simulated wave of U.S. jets appeared to vanish from their screens only to reappear at simulated strike points seconds later. A training glitch, they claimed. But the generals knew better. In one classified cable, a Soviet field commander warned, "We are no longer tracking the West. The West is tracking us." The humiliation wasn't in the battlefield, it was in the boardroom. The Kremlin demanded answers. But when those answers came, they weren't just incomplete, they were incoherent. Different departments blamed each other. Communications said it was radar failure. Radar blamed signals interference. The KGB blamed GDR technicians. No one blamed the possibility they feared most, that the Americans had someone on the inside. And still, Orion delivered. One final drop arrived that spring, containing a list of KGB handlers assigned to covert industrial espionage in Sweden and Norway. Each one was rotated out within weeks. Each one was replaced with a less experienced officer. NATO doubled their counterintelligence output. The Soviets quietly cut funding. The scoreboard didn't lie. The US had penetrated the Soviets' own perception of reality, not with bullets, not with bombs, but with foresight, with one man. Orion had turned Soviet confidence into a liability, and in doing so, he forced an empire to question its own invincibility. By late 1985, the Soviet Union's intelligence elite faced a quiet but undeniable collapse. Not a revolution, not a scandal, something deeper, a strategic and ideological unraveling. On the surface, Moscow still postured. The Kremlin paraded new weapons systems, rolled out advanced radar models, and conducted aggressive drills in Eastern Europe. But beneath that bravado, the heart of the system the intelligence organs meant to detect, predict, and defend had been hollowed out. And it was all because of one man. Orion's intelligence didn't just bleed secrets, it exposed an epistemological failure. The KGB and GRU no longer trusted their own data. They second-guessed intercepted NATO messages, fearing planted disinformation. Field agents stopped relying on known protocols, afraid that every step might be one the Americans were already watching. This was more than paranoia. It was a breakdown in confidence. Entire departments began operating in isolation. The KGB's third directorate, responsible for military counterintelligence, stopped sharing information with the first chief directorate, fearing leaks. Soviet defense planners started red-teaming their own conclusions, assuming their logic had already been gamed by the CIA. What emerged wasn't just dysfunction. It was strategic paralysis. Even worse was the ideological fallout. Orion hadn't defected. He hadn't appeared on American television or sought asylum. He had simply acted, without a manifesto, without explanation, without acknowledgement. He betrayed the Soviet system not with rage, but with calculation. That terrified Moscow, because it meant the very idea that the Soviet state-inspired loyalty was under threat. It meant that belief in Marxism-Leninism wasn't enough to hold the machine together. That fear and control and surveillance couldn't prevent disillusionment. The system had been built on the assumption that the West could be resisted not just militarily, but morally. That it was corrupt, decadent, disorganized, but the precision of the American response, their ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outpredict shattered that myth. Orion had become a ghost in the Soviet machine, and that ghost whispered one thing. They know us better than we know ourselves. Inside Langley, analysts noticed a shift. Fewer Soviet agents were operating abroad. Recruitment dried up. Eastern Bloc collaborators grew hesitant. For the first time, American handlers weren't just outplaying their opponents, they were watching them retreat in real time. It wasn't victory through battle. It was victory through doubt. A war where the greatest weapon was a file folder, a whisper, a name no one could say aloud in the Kremlin. Orion, the man who made a superpower question whether it had ever been secure at all. He was never caught. To this day, no official record exists of Orion's true identity, not in declassified CIA archives, not in Soviet files recovered after the collapse, not in the whispered memoirs of defectors who fled east or west. His codename endures. His face does not. Some believe he died in Moscow, undetected. Others say he was exfiltrated under a false identity, granted a new life in rural America or Western Europe. A few claim he was never a single person. but a composite of multiple sources rolled into one myth for security. Langley, of course, has never confirmed a thing. But the files he provided, the thousands of documents, were real. They shaped U.S. Cold War policy. They restructured NATO deployments. They upended KGB counterintelligence. And they exposed the most dangerous flaw in any authoritarian system, the inability to imagine internal failure. Orion didn't just leak secrets. He proved that loyalty, forced or faked, wasn't enough to keep a system intact. He showed that fear is brittle, that belief can crack, that silence doesn't always mean submission. After the Cold War ended, fragments of his legacy emerged in strange places. In East German archives, Western analysts found references to the phantom source used to justify a sudden wave of counterintelligence arrests in 1986. In a defunct Polish surveillance hub, a technician's notebook included a list of NATO jamming frequencies, none of which had ever been published. In Moscow, a junior analyst working under the post-Soviet FSB found an old audio reel in an unmarked file drawer. On it, the voice of a man reading a Soviet cable, dated 3 days before it had been officially transmitted. A whisper in a steel vault, the ghost, still echoing. Even now, intelligence agencies debate Orion's motives. Was it disillusionment, ideological reversal, a quiet revenge against an institution that demanded loyalty but offered only suspicion? The truth may never be known. But one thing is certain. Orion changed the Cold War not with a bomb, not with a bullet, but with a file. And in doing so, he became something more dangerous than any defector or double agent. He became the one thing the Soviet system was never built to face. A believer who no longer believed